The Arizona-Mexico borderlands of 1882 witnessed countless acts of cruelty. But when rancher James McKenna found an Apache woman fleeing across his property in the dead of night, his decision to help her reach safety would trigger a confrontation with Sheriff Clayton Briggs that exposed the darkest aspects of territorial law. Running Dove, escaping forced servitude after being captured in a raid, never expected compassion from a white rancher, nor could she have imagined that the sheriff who pursued her claimed legal ownership through a document that reduced human beings to property. What unfolded over the following weeks would challenge the very foundations of justice in the territory and forge an unlikely alliance that would reshape how the law viewed native captives forever. Chapter 1. Night Flight Across Dangerous Ground. The Arizona-Mexico borderlands stretched endlessly beneath the October moon of 1882, a harsh landscape where territorial law often meant whatever men with guns decided it meant. James McKenna's ranch occupied 40,000 acres of this unforgiving terrain, positioned strategically along routes that smugglers, raiders, and desperate souls used to cross between two nations that barely controlled their shared frontier. At 38, James had built his cattle empire through shrewd dealings and careful neutrality in the conflicts that regularly erupted between Apache bands, Mexican authorities, and American settlers who viewed this desert as their manifest destiny. The night that would transform James from passive observer to active participant in the struggle for human dignity began with his horse's nervous whinnying echoing across the desert stillness. Years of frontier living had taught him to recognize the different warnings his animals provided. This particular sound indicated human presence rather than predators, someone moving with a desperation that made stealth impossible. James grabbed his Winchester and moved carefully toward the barn, expecting to find Mexican bandits or Apache raiders attempting to steal his prized breeding stock. What he discovered instead stopped him cold in the doorway of his barn. A young Apache woman crouched in the corner of an empty stall, her breathing ragged from exhaustion, her traditional dress torn and stained with blood that appeared both fresh and dried from older wounds. Her dark eyes held the wild terror of a hunted animal, yet beneath the fear burned a fierce determination that spoke of extraordinary endurance. The moonlight streaming through the barn windows revealed rope burns around her wrists, bruises that told stories of violence, and most tellingly, a brand mark on her shoulder that James recognized with sickening clarity. Running Dove, though James wouldn't learn her name until later, had escaped from one of the trafficking operations that flourished along the border under the pretense of legitimate captive trading. Mexican raiders would capture Apache women during attacks on villages, then sell them to American buyers who claimed them as property under territorial laws that classified native captives as chattel. The brand on her shoulder belonged to Sheriff Clayton Briggs, a man whose official position provided cover for his involvement in what amounted to human slavery dressed in legal terminology. James faced a decision that would shatter his carefully maintained neutrality and place him in direct conflict with the very law enforcement that supposedly protected territorial citizens. The smart choice involved reporting Running Dove's presence to Sheriff Briggs, collecting whatever finder's fee might be offered, and continuing his profitable existence without complications. The territory's legal structure clearly supported Briggs's claim to ownership, while helping an escaped Apache woman could result in criminal charges, violence from Briggs's deputies, or worse, becoming a target for the sheriff's extensive network of corrupt associates. Yet something in Running Dove's eyes spoke to James's long-suppressed conscience, awakening moral clarity he had buried beneath years of pragmatic survival. The systematic dehumanization of native people had become so normalized in territorial society that most settlers never questioned its fundamental evil. James himself had turned away from numerous injustices, telling himself that survival required compromise, that challenging the system would only result in his own destruction without helping anyone. Without speaking, James retrieved medical supplies from his ranch house and began treating Running Dove's injuries with gentle efficiency that gradually calmed her panic. His Spanish, learned through years of cross-border cattle trading, proved sufficient to communicate basic reassurances that he meant no harm, that she could rest safely while regaining strength. Running Dove's gradual relaxation revealed an intelligence that assessed his sincerity with careful precision. Her survival instincts honed through experiences that would have destroyed lesser spirits. As dawn approached across the desert landscape, James understood that harboring Running Dove meant accepting consequences that would ripple through every aspect of his carefully ordered existence, transforming him from a successful rancher to an outlaw in the eyes of territorial law. Chapter 2. The Sheriff's Claim. 3 days passed in tense vigilance before the inevitable arrived at James McKenna's ranch in the form of Sheriff Clayton Briggs and 6 armed deputies, their approach announced by a dust cloud that rose like a harbinger of violence across the desert landscape. James had spent those days learning Running Dove's story through halting Spanish conversations, each revelation deepening his resolve to protect her from a man who claimed ownership over human beings as casually as one might claim stray cattle. Her account of systematic abuse, forced labor, and the trafficking of dozens of Apache women had transformed his initial compassion into righteous determination. Sheriff Briggs dismounted with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation backed by legal authority. At 52, his weathered face bore the cruel satisfaction of someone who had discovered how to profit from human misery while maintaining the facade of lawful behavior. His deputies spread out in practice formation, their hands resting on pistol grips in a display of force meant to communicate that resistance would be met with violence sanctioned by territorial law. The sheriff's voice carried across the ranch yard with practiced authority as he presented documents bearing official seals and signatures. These papers, issued by the territorial court in Prescott, declared Running Dove legally bound property, captured during what Briggs described as a lawful military action against hostile Apache bands. The documents classified her as contraband of war, subject to custody by whoever held proper claim, which Briggs asserted through a bill of sale from Mexican traders who had originally captured her during a raid on her village 2 years earlier. James examined the papers with the careful attention his years of cattle contracts had taught him, recognizing both their technical legality under current territorial statutes and the moral abomination they represented. The law that Briggs wielded like a weapon had been crafted by men who viewed native people as obstacles to progress, their humanity subordinated to the territorial expansion that enriched speculators and officials. These same laws have been used to justify the seizure of Apache lands, the forced relocation of entire tribes, and now, the reduction of human beings to commercial property. The confrontation that followed tested every diplomatic skill James had developed through years of navigating border conflicts. He neither confirmed nor denied Running Dove's presence, instead questioning the validity of documents that showed signs of forgery in their dates and inconsistent signatures. Briggs's growing anger revealed a man unaccustomed to resistance, especially from fellow white settlers who were expected to support the racial hierarchy that territorial society enforced through both law and custom. Running Dove, hidden in the root cellar beneath James's kitchen, could hear every word of the exchange through the floorboards. Her testimony, whispered to James during their previous conversations, had revealed that Briggs operated a network extending from Sonora to Tucson, trafficking Apache women to brothels, wealthy households seeking servants, and even to mines where they labored under conditions that killed most within months. She had named 17 other women currently held in similar bondage, their locations scattered across properties that Briggs protected through his authority as sheriff. The standoff escalated when Briggs ordered his deputies to search the property, a command James countered by invoking his property rights under territorial law, demanding a proper warrant issued by a judge rather than documents generated by Briggs himself. This legal technicality, learned from years of protecting his ranch from claim jumpers, bought precious time but infuriated the sheriff, who recognized that James was using the very legal system Briggs had manipulated against him. Briggs's final threat came wrapped in the language of legal consequence and social destruction. He promised criminal charges for harboring fugitive property, suggested that James's cattle contracts with the Army would disappear, and implied that accidents happened frequently to ranchers who challenged territorial authority. His deputies reinforced these threats with meaningful adjustments to their gun belts, their message clear despite being unspoken. As the sheriff's party rode away, James understood that he had perhaps a week before Briggs returned with whatever documentation would authorize a thorough search, time he would need to build a legal defense that could challenge the entire system of human trafficking disguised as territorial law. Chapter 3: Building the Defense. The journey to Tucson required careful planning that balanced speed with secrecy, as James McKenna understood that Sheriff Briggs had eyes throughout the territory watching for any attempt to challenge his authority. Running Dove traveled hidden beneath canvas in James's supply wagon, her presence disguised as cargo, while James maintained the appearance of a routine business trip to purchase winter supplies. The 60-mile journey across desert terrain took 2 days of careful navigation, avoiding main trails where Briggs's associates might intercept them. Judge Samuel Whitman represented everything that Clayton Briggs was not, a man whose commitment to justice transcended the racial prejudices that infected territorial law. Appointed by President Arthur himself, Whitman had earned a reputation for interpreting statutes through the lens of constitutional principles rather than local custom, making him one of the few legal authorities willing to challenge the systematic dehumanization of Native peoples. His modest office above the Tucson Mercantile Building had become a refuge for those seeking justice against the corruption that flourished throughout the territory. The judge listened to Running Dove's testimony with careful attention, his lined face growing increasingly grave as she described the trafficking network that operated under the protection of law enforcement badges. Through James's translation, she detailed locations where women were held, names of officials who participated in the trade, and most importantly, the methods used to forge documents that created legal ownership over human beings. Her photographic memory for details, developed through survival necessity, provided evidence that would prove invaluable in court. Whitman's legal research revealed precedents that challenged the very foundation of Briggs's claims. The 14th Amendment, ratified 14 years earlier, guaranteed equal protection under law to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, language that federal courts had begun interpreting as extending certain protections to Native peoples despite their complex legal status. Additionally, several federal judges in California and Nevada had recently ruled that territorial laws could not supersede constitutional protections against involuntary servitude, even when disguised as legitimate captive trading. The investigation that followed uncovered a network of corruption extending far beyond Sheriff Briggs himself. James spent his nights visiting saloons and trading posts, gathering testimonies from men whose consciences had been troubled by what they had witnessed, but who had previously lacked the courage to speak against a sheriff who controlled their economic survival. Marcus Rodriguez, a freight operator who had unknowingly transported captive women hidden in his wagons, provided documentation of suspicious shipments that Briggs had personally overseen. Samuel Chun, who operated a boarding house near the sheriff's office, testified about women kept locked in back rooms, their cries muffled while prominent citizens conducted business in the front parlor. The Apache Tribal Council, reached through intermediaries who carried Running Dove's message to the San Carlos Reservation, provided crucial support by documenting the systematic raids that had taken their women. Chief Nate himself sent sworn statements detailing attacks that Briggs had dismissed as Mexican bandit activity, despite evidence pointing to organized traffickers operating with inside knowledge of Apache movements. These testimonies, transcribed by Indian agency officials sympathetic to the cause, created a paper trail that contradicted Briggs's claims of legitimate military captures. Most damaging to Briggs's case were the documents themselves, which Judge Whitman subjected to forensic examination using techniques learned from fraud cases in San Francisco. The dates on bills of sale predated the actual raids by weeks, suggesting documents prepared in advance rather than legitimate records of specific captures. Signatures supposedly from Mexican military officials matched known authorities in Sonora, while the territorial court seals showed variations indicating forgery rather than authentic judicial stamps. As November arrived with its cooling desert winds, James and Judge Whitman had assembled a legal case that would challenge not just Sheriff Briggs's claim to Running Dove, but the entire structure of human trafficking that operated throughout the Arizona Territory. The hearing, scheduled for the Territorial Court's winter session, would draw attention from newspapers, federal authorities, and most importantly, from Native communities who saw in Running Dove's case a chance to strike back at the systematic theft of their people disguised as frontier justice. Chapter 4: Justice in the Desert. The Tucson courthouse filled beyond capacity on the morning of November 15, 1882, as word of the unprecedented hearing had spread throughout the territory, drawing journalists from as far as San Francisco and concerned citizens who sensed that this case would determine whether law in the Arizona Territory served justice or merely sanctioned oppression. Judge Samuel Whitman presided over an atmosphere charged with tension, as Sheriff Clayton Briggs sat confidently at the prosecution table, surrounded by territorial officials who had profited from the system now under scrutiny. James McKenna and Running Dove occupied the defense table, their presence a visual challenge to the racial hierarchies that territorial society considered immutable. Running Dove's testimony, delivered in clear English that shocked those who expected broken communication from an Apache woman, systematically dismantled every legal pretense that Briggs had constructed around his trafficking operation. She described her capture during a peaceful gathering where Apache families had been harvesting mescal, an attack that resulted in 13 women being taken while their men were murdered attempting protection. Her account of the subsequent journey revealed a well-organized pipeline that moved human cargo through established routes, with law enforcement officials providing safe passage in exchange for financial compensation. The evidence that Judge Whitman admitted into the record painted a devastating picture of corruption that reached into every level of territorial governance. Financial ledgers, seized from Briggs's office through a federal warrant, showed payments to judges who validated ownership documents, military officers who provided armed escorts for trafficking convoys, and even Indian agency officials who falsified death records to prevent families from searching for missing women. The amounts involved staggered observers who had assumed the trade operated on a small scale, revealing instead an industry that generated thousands of dollars monthly through human misery. James McKenna's testimony provided the perspective of a white rancher whose conscience had finally overcome his complicity through silence, his words carrying weight with territorial citizens who might dismiss Native testimony, but couldn't ignore one of their own. He described conversations with Briggs where the sheriff had brazenly discussed his trafficking operations, confident that racial solidarity would prevent any white man from supporting Apache claims to personhood. These revelations forced many in the courtroom to confront their own passive acceptance of systems they had known were morally indefensible but had tolerated for personal advantage. The legal arguments presented by Judge Whitman's appointed prosecutor focused on federal supremacy over territorial statutes, citing recent Supreme Court decisions that established constitutional protections extending to all persons within American jurisdiction, regardless of race or previous condition. The 13th Amendment's prohibition against involuntary servitude, the prosecutor argued, could not be circumvented through territorial laws that classified certain humans as property based on their ethnic origin. This interpretation challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which frontier society had built its economic and social structures. Sheriff Briggs's defense collapsed spectacularly when 3 of his own deputies, granted immunity in exchange for testimony, revealed the full scope of the trafficking network. They described raids specifically targeting Apache camps known to contain young women, coordination with Mexican slavers who provided cross-border transportation, and a systematic forgery of documents that created legal ownership over human beings. Their testimony, motivated by self-preservation rather than conscience, nevertheless provided insider confirmation of everything Running Dove and the investigation had revealed. Judge Whitman's ruling came down with the force of moral clarity backed by legal precedent. He declared all territorial statutes that classified Native captives as property null and void, establishing that constitutional protections against involuntary servitude applied regardless of race or circumstances of capture. Furthermore, He ordered the immediate arrest of Sheriff Briggs and 17 co-conspirators on federal charges of conspiracy to violate constitutional rights, human trafficking, and corruption of public office. The aftermath of the ruling sent shockwaves throughout the territorial system. Running Dove, finally free to determine her own destiny, chose to remain at James's ranch not as property or servant, but as a full partner in the cattle operation, her business acumen proving invaluable for expansion into new markets. Her legal victory became a precedent that other Native women used to challenge their own captivity, ultimately dismantling the entire trafficking network that had operated under color of law throughout the Southwest. Running Dove's courage and James McKenna's conscience proved that even the most corrupt laws crumble when good people stand together for justice. If this powerful story of freedom and moral courage inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold tales of frontier justice. What would you have risked to save another human being? Share your thoughts below.